I am back, so let's kick things off with something magnificent. That's right, folks, we are back, and what better way to celebrate the return from my period in exile than with a very cool piece of Age of Sigmar miniature goodness. So Sigvald, the Prince of Slaanesh, is on the slab this week. We're just going to be keeping this as a simple, straightforward, how I did it, hope you like it kind of video. We don't need to talk too much about it. Let's just get to the down cam and take a look at Sigvald, because he's beautiful, and I love him. And I think you're going to love him too. Let's check it out. Okay, starting out here, I wanted a really brilliant gold for Sigvald. I wanted him to really shine. There's like a non-metallic metal on the box art, which I think is definitely a really cool way to approach this miniature, and is definitely a way that you can go with it. But I wanted to do things a little bit differently. So we've gone with Vallejo metal color gold, which I've airbrushed all over the armor here. You don't have to do this with an airbrush. You absolutely can take the approach of brushing this on. It'll just take you a little bit longer if you do. Once that's all dry, I'm then going to get some Rakeland Flesh Shade over it. Now, this is an interesting one because the Vallejo Gold is much colder than the sort of GW equivalents that you normally would expect to see. And so the Rakeland Flesh Shade sort of starts to bring in this quite strong warm-cold contrast straight off the bat. And so we may as well lean into that. We may as well push that as far as we can. And so what I decided to do next was take Druchii Violet and actually kind of use it like a glaze and start to reinforce the shadows with it. So we end up being almost quite kind of pink in the shadows, and then we have this sort of warm gold mid-tone going into a cold gold sort of upper mid-tone. And then, as you can see in a moment, we're going to start getting on some highlights for that. So this is what we've got so far, and I think this is going to look really, really nice. I think this is definitely heading in the right direction. But before we finish off the armor, I actually want to take just a little detour. And that is so that I can wiggle just into those little tight areas of skin, those sort of harder to reach places, with a bit of Rakarth flesh. And I'm doing this at this point now because there's going to be some gold that comes very, very close to those areas. And if I need to make any corrections, I want to do it while things are still quite simple before I have to correct like an entire workup, which would obviously be a bit of a nightmare. Okay, so continuing with this flesh workup then, from that Rakarth flesh, we're now going to start to glaze some Nocturna Shadow into the recesses. Now, Nocturna Shadow is from the Vallejo, I think it's called the Malefic Flesh set, or the Fairy Flesh set. These are made by Vallejo on behalf of Nocturna Miniatures. They're quite easy to get hold of. I don't know if Vallejo do equivalent colours in their main range, but the sets, the Nocturna sets, are well worth a look. If not, just find a colour that's similar. It's absolutely fine to just use proxies for things that are close. And while I've got that Nocturna Shadow on the brush, on the palette, I may as well also base coat his face with it. We're going to be doing the face in a slightly different way to the rest of the flesh, because most of the other flesh areas aren't really seen. They're obscured by other things, so we're just going to use a simple workup for those. When we get to the face, we're going to go far more into a complex, more traditional painting style workup. It's going to be pretty cool, pretty interesting, so stick around and you'll see that soon. Now, going back to those simpler areas of flesh, I'm going to use some reddish flesh, again, kind of like a glaze, just to start to warm up some of those areas. And this does take a little bit of back and forth. You do have to sort of wiggle around between the Rakarth flesh and the Nocturna Shadow and the reddish flesh and sort of adjust to taste. But eventually you can get to a flesh tone that looks like this, and this is fine for these kind of obscured areas of flesh. There's really no need to go into greater detail than this. When you look at the miniature in your hand, you don't really get a proper opportunity to look at those areas of flesh very much. I know, for example, the butt cheek had a lot of attention drawn to it in some of the artwork that Games Workshop showed. When you see the miniature on the battlefield, that area is almost impossible to actually get a look at. Anyway, let's now go from butt cheeks to battle plate, and we're going to start to finish that armor off now. So we're going to just grab the original base color first, that Vallejo metal color gold, and just start to kind of scratch in some textural highlights. This is almost more of a map, just to kind of tell us where we want to place our highlights. And so we can afford to be pretty rough at this stage. You really don't need to be too precise, too exact. It's going to go the way you want it to anyway. And then we'll just start working Vallejo Metal Color Chrome into the gold in increasing amounts, being finer and finer and more careful with the highlights, building them up until we get all the way to just a few pure chrome highlights here and there. Once you make it all the way up to that pure chrome, this is what it's going to look like. It's a pretty cool armor workup. Okay, let's start to look at some of those capes now. Barak Nar Burgundy is going to be where we start out. And we're just going to be hitting the backs of those capes for the most part, just sort of trying to get some nice flat even coverage, so a couple of really thin coats just to get that built up looking nice and flat and even. And then we can start to build up some highlights using P3's Murderous Magenta. And what we're going to do is just keep slowly building up highlights over time. We're going to be very gentle with this, use a lot of sort of glazes and semi-glazes until we get up to something that looks like this. And then we'll grab some Vallejo Model Color Sunny Skin Tone and we'll just start to pull in a few mixtures of Sunny Skin Tone into those base colors to sort of get some scratchy textural highlights building up here and there. Okay, now Vallejo Model Color Emerald is going to provide the insides of all of these capes for us. There's also just a few sort of smaller details, a few kind of gemstones, and mainly the shield that I wanted to base coat with this. So there's quite a few little bits to base coat with this emerald. It's a stunning color though, and so I do think it's worth making a feature of. And maybe somewhat predictably, mixtures of emerald and sunny skin tone are where we're going to get our highlights from. Again, I'm going to use a few different methods here. The sort of gemstony bits will be more kind of just layered. There'll be kind of texture built into the cape, and then a mixture of sort of wet blending and dithering to be used on the front of the shield. There's a couple of different approaches, and I think it's nice to sometimes do that, to take one color pairing and treat it in different ways across a miniature to demonstrate a sort of range of different textural visual approaches that all use the same color but produce different effects. I'm also going to use P3's Exile Blue to shade those areas, and in this case we will be sort of being fairly universal, just using it as a glaze. On the cape it's going to be tricky to work this down as a glaze. You're going to find that you'll probably have to do quite a bit of back and forth work to get things looking smooth. What might be easier on the underside of this cape, I'll be honest, I didn't realise this until after I'd finished this, but what might be easier would actually be to base coat the underside of the capes in Exile Blue and then do a blended workup into Emerald as a sort of way of transitioning smoothly. I think that would possibly give you a bit of an easier time. You could ultimately get pretty much the same effect, just with a bit less effort. And so after quite a bit of effort, quite a bit of back and forth, just refining those teals, I ended up with this. I was pretty happy with how things were looking at this stage, but there were now just a few sort of small insignificant things that I just wanted to get done off camera, a bit of tidying up, a bit of prep work, that sort of thing. So we're just going to flash forward now to after I had done those things. Okay, super quick for the next bit, we're just going to get the patterning on the cape done. This is sculpted detail, so it's not particularly hard. You're just going to want to sort of flat brush it, you know, keep your brush kind of flat to it, and it's going to go on pretty easily, pretty neatly. Okay, going to do a little neat trick here. Going to use the sort of matteness and the kind of dustiness of Nuln oil to our advantage. We're going to keep building this up now to form shadows on the blade. And what we're effectively doing here is kind of the same patterning treatment that you would do to create a non-metallic metal. But the blade is Vallejo chrome, and then we're using Nuln oil to create the sort of contrast points in it. So we're kind of doing a non-metallic metal application, but using metallics and glazes, and the Nuln oil here just does a really good job of forming our shades with a bit of building up. So obviously after that Nuln oil we then need to push the reflections up a little bit more, so now it's pure chrome going in the opposite direction to those shadows that we've put in, and that's going to really sort of sell this reflective look for us. Okay, for the next while I'm going to be putting Sigvald down, and I'm going to be concentrating more just on his face specifically now for a while. So here's where he's at right now. Here's what I'm working with at this stage, but we are now going to move on to the face. Okay, next up, something a little bit different here. I want you to enjoy a time-lapse of me painting Sigvald's face. Normally I would do sort of stages and show you the applications, but things are kind of pretty straightforward here. You'll be able to see from this time lapse, all I'm really doing is just heavy glazes. The colours that I'm using are exactly the same colours that I used on the skin previously. I'm just starting with the shadow colour and building up here. So I'll just take the mid-tone colour, which is Rakar Flesh, mix it into the shadow colour, start to glaze up some mid-tones, then go to pure Rakar Flesh, reinforce those mid-tones, bring in my red tones, pull in a few highlights. As a process, pretty straightforward, but I think it's a bit more interesting maybe to see the whole thing develop instead of just being talked through a little snippet of each bit. So this is a bit of a longer section as we're going through this time-lapsed footage. What I also had to end up doing was just cut this just before I'd finished it and put the last touches in, because actually the sculpt is so fine and the areas are so detailed that I had to get my head really, really close to the miniature to be able to see what I was doing, which meant I couldn't possibly have a camera in there showing you what I was doing. So the time-lapse footage does cut kind of just before we finish, but it does kind of show pretty much the entire process. There's not really anything missed out. I think when I got to painting the eyes, I think I kind of just painted like a pale colour in there and then put a really thin glaze of murderous magenta in there, as memory serves. Other than that, I don't think there's anything that you'll miss in this time-lapse footage. So I'll shut up now and just let it complete, and you can enjoy that. Okay, now I'm going to do the horns. I'm going to do some blending between kind of a white and that nocturnal shadow. And I think it's cool to pull that base tone of the skin in and use that to feature in the horns. I think that sort of creates a bit of a visual relationship between those two items and, you know, makes them look like they belong together. It was a bit laborious working between this really bright white and this really dark sort of green. So yeah, I'm skipping through it a little bit, but it's a combination of different types of blending. We did some sort of striping, we did a bit of wet blending, I sort of tidied things up with some glazes. It's a bit complex, I will be honest. You've probably got a method for painting horns that you prefer already, and you know, if you want it to look roughly the same as mine, then just use roughly the same colours and you'll get there. But then, once all of that sort of blending work is done along the body of the horns, all I need to do from there is just glaze some Nuln Oil into the tips, circle a bit of Nuln Oil around the roots just to give them that sort of faded transition in a nice, quick and easy way, and we're basically done with the horns. And then once the horns are complete, I just need to kind of get his hair blocked in. I mostly wanted him to just sort of have black hair. The blonde hair in the box art is nice, it's fine, but it's a bit expected, I think. It's just a little bit stock, so yeah, in my head I thought it'd be a bit cooler to give him black hair and I give him a sort of Cruella de Vil streak through it, or I don't know, Rogue from X-Men I suppose, just for something a bit interesting, a bit different to look at. And then from there it's really just the base to get finished off. There's not a ton else needed on the miniature, but the base does have quite a lot of detail on it. I decided that actually if I'd have talked through the base, then this would have ended up becoming a really long tutorial. So what I decided to do instead was fill in the base off camera. Now we're going to take you to some 360 rotation footage. And there he is, beyond doubt. one of my favourite miniatures that has been released by Games Workshop this year, and I have a feeling that even by the end of the year, I'll probably still be saying that. It's a marvellous sculpt, an absolutely fantastic, graceful, yet still dangerous looking character, and it's a really, really cool, inspiring piece that I had a lot of fun with. So folks, I hope you liked that one. I hope that you'll find this useful as a jumping off point for some ideas as to where you can go with Sigvald. If you liked the video, please do give it a thumbs up to let me know that you liked it. You can of course also subscribe to the channel, and if you hit the bell icon, you can enable notifications so that you'll stay up to date on what I'm doing here on YouTube. If you love the content and you want to support it, there's a link to my Patreon down in the description with tiers starting from 70p a month. So I'm going to get out of here for now, folks. I'm going to wrap this one up and roll those end credits, but thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now, everybody.